welcome everybody. I'm not addressing anybody in particular. All of you who have been kind enough to join us today evening to this webinar series on culture studies in of Keralam, politics, praxis, methods. I begin by thanking all of you on this historic day, at least for me, which marks the beginning of a year-long scrutiny of a discipline or a non-discipline. I would like to call it that. A discipline that has contributed so diversely to the imaginations around Keralam in new ways. As a distinct and meaningful social, political, and cultural region. The literature that I'm teaching today as a teacher is very different from what I taught, what I learned as a student. So, in the past 3 or 4 decades, I think, literary studies in India has undergone a paradigm shift. Elite canonical literature that was regarded as expressions of transhistorical, if not universal, human values, all became replaced, in some sense, by texts that were complicated by caste, by class, gender, sexuality, etc. In a sense, there were also attempts to introduce methods of analysis that attempted to resituate such canonical literary texts within history. Yeah. History became so important, which also brought in, if I can call it that, a kind of a post colonial slant to reading. There were also attempts to understand in what ways texts gave expression to the values, to the concerns of the social order from which they derived. Context. Context became so important. So this is where I think I'm particularly speaking from the perspective of a student of literature in India. Literature departments in India, maybe all over the world to a certain extent, transformed themselves to include cultural studies. Literature began to be looked at, in a sense, as elitist and politically suspect of being part of a complicity with power, representing, in a sense, conservative values of a repressive tradition. So this is a shift that it was a paradigm shift to many of us, a shift from the what I could call the generic neutrality of literary studies, with its emphasis on universality and aesthetics, to the politicality of culture studies. Somebody said this webinar is very ideological. It is ideological. Cultural studies is nothing but ideological. It has to be ideological. The Frankfurt School was ideological. The Birmingham School was ideological. And I think each and every culture studies scholar in Kerala is ideological. I'm unashamedly, unapologetic about it. I think, along with this, what many of us felt was a major shift was also a kind of a suspicion of disciplinarity. We in India tend to think of disciplines as watertight compartments. But then the idea that disciplines themselves are entrenched systems of power, as people like Foucault have pointed out, disciplines may be identified neither with an institution nor with an apparatus. It is a type of power. To think of disciplines themselves as types of power, modalities for the exercise of power, comprising of a whole set of instruments and techniques and procedures, levels of application, targets, as Foucault would say, it is a physics or an anatomy of power, and disciplines therefore fixes, they arrest or regulate movement. I think at some point in all our lives we have suffered because of these disciplinary rigidities, the kinds of power systems disciplines have exerted over us. So I think in the last few decades, there was a very significant move towards interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, which has very significantly complicated the academic terrain in very many ways. But however, feel that this, this shift towards interdisciplinarity, the shift towards multidisciplinarity, would be useless without first questioning the use of disciplines themselves as instruments of social control, challenging the disciplinary limits of discourse. And that is the reason why today, at the outset of this webinar series, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to be, as cultural studies scholars, to speak of counter-disciplinarity, to move against this kind of a disciplinarity, which again has a set of problems which I think Professor Rajan Gurukkal would be addressing in his talk, in his lecture, because when you go in for that kind of a change and say that we are being counter-disciplinary, there are also methodological issues which I'm sure we'll also cover in the lectures to come. So a method was needed that would help literature departments analyze a greater variety of cultural products from a historically specific perspective. And therefore, this turned to a range of new theoretical approaches that allowed many of us to think about the relationships of text and context in new ways, new ways of thinking, including neo-Marxism, post-structuralism, and many of the theoretical advances made by feminist theory, Dalit studies. Uh, and I particularly want to refer to the fact that the use of the term culture in an expanded sense referred not just to canonical texts of high literature or other elite literary or cultural forms, but in an anthropological sense, as Raymond Williams, for example, has used it as a whole way of life. So, culture studies in that sense is thus committed to the study of an entire range of a society's arts, beliefs, institutions, communicative practices. And many of my scholars, many of the culture studies researchers and students who are doing culture studies in India today, they found a theoretical legitimation, if I can call it that, for vastly expanding the purview of their investigations. One of the key premises of cultural studies as it is being practiced today is that culture production is always intertextual. It is not born in a vacuum, but draws upon pre-existent cultural forms. I see many non-academics also here, so I was thinking a little bit of an explanation would be useful. So cultural products are always, in that sense, polysemic. They have multiple meanings that can be activated in different ways by different kinds of audiences inhabiting different social locations or positionalities. But then the way cultural studies developed in Kerala, I think, and of course in the larger context of India, but specifically in Kerala, there's a slight difference from, say, how it developed in Britain during the rise of the British culture studies, the School of British Cultural Studies. In Britain, for example, culture studies was already, had already established itself as a new kind of an academic enterprise, as a field of study, born out of sociology, of social history, of Marxism, the numerous kinds of critiques of Gramsci and Althusser. So all these were, in a sense, already in place when other movements, other fields of study, like feminism, for example, came into the scene, and they started asking rather niggling, uncomfortable questions within culture studies. But in Kerala and in India in general, the trajectory of culture studies is slightly different because culture studies became possible in our own critical terrain in a sense because it was already opened up by Dalit studies and women's studies, so to speak. So these fields of study had made multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity a necessity. We as culture studies scholars didn't have to argue for a certain kind of multidisciplinarity to be brought in because it had already been made possible by women studies scholars and Dalit studies scholars. So it was already there. And as critics like, say, for example, Niranjana, Tejaswini Niranjana have pointed out, culture studies, in a sense, owed a lot of debts to in that sense to women's studies and Dalit studies. And they were foundational to the emergence of culture studies in Keralam and also in the larger context of India. Just like women's studies or Dalit studies, issues of power, issues of hegemony were crucial to cultural studies. And the kind of trenchant critiques of hegemonic institutions and disciplinary structures in particular raised by culture studies, in a sense, I think have shaken, often shaken many disciplinary bastions. I, for myself, have experienced this. I still remember when I was a younger, a teacher in a university, I was asked the question, why should any English department study Kerala? Is it at all necessary? Shouldn't our focus be on British literature and English literature in general or English literary studies in general? So, rethinking the political, for example, became so crucial to cultural studies, unpacking the pleasures of the popular. These became some of the key projects as they were undertaken by culture studies scholars in Kerala. But what has been most significant to the different modes of culture studies praxis in Keralam, I think, has been an effort to move beyond the constant preoccupation with the everyday and the now, which is a marked trait of culture studies as it is practiced in the US, for example. This kind of a constant preoccupation with what is happening in contemporary history, with the everyday and the now. But in Keralam, there has, I think, been a very significant shift. That shift is towards a focus, a very, very conscious focus upon the historicity of culture. This is probably the reason why so much of the culture studies work that has been done in Kerala has critiqued colonial and alternative modernities as they came up here. So I think that's a very important difference that we need to really stress upon as far as culture studies in Kerala is concerned. But also to move forward, I think alternatively fields of studies like women's studies, gender studies, have all benefited immensely from some of the questions that culture studies sought to raise, especially in fraught terrains like popular culture, mass culture, where the stakes for women are especially high. So that is, I think, there was a give and take between women's studies and gender studies departments and culture studies, and this, I think, is a particular point to be cited. See, when I was a student, I could never think that I could study popular cinema or shopping malls or ask questions why women read popular romances or watch soap operas without it meaning that I had capitulated to the logic of the mass market in my academic endeavors. So this is where all these questions, all these different fields of study come in to complicate the terrain. And this is where I see culture studies as it is being practiced in Kerala today, not as a discipline per se. I would not want to see it as a discipline. And that is where I have a particular kind of, I don't know, I think I'm very unhappy when people begin to talk about an MA in culture studies, even the Center for Culture Studies in that sense. I would not want it to be institutionalized in the way that, many other disciplines have been institutionalized. So I would like to see culture studies as a discipline, not as a discipline per se, but as one resisting disciplinization, as something that is situated in the cracks, in the fissures between disciplines in order to engage in oppositional and subversive readings of texts and contexts. So for me, it is more a mode of practice, of engaged scholarship, an interdisciplinary method which would bring together opposing critical positionalities. And that is where I would rather call it an anti-discipline, because it is constantly throwing stones at disciplinary boundaries, asking worrying questions. So it goes beyond, or it goes against the grain of disciplinary power and its logic. So this is precisely its modus operandi in Keralam too, where it has opened up new fissures, new continuities that have challenged the established distinctions between canonical domains of learning and the emergent everyday, between all kinds of hierarchical knowledges, epistemology, methodologies and non-generic areas or arenas of inquiry. It has focused on marginalized actors. It has focused on disappeared texts. It has focused on epochal discontents and unruly subjectivities, all of which I think have gone into the historical and cultural making as also unmaking of Keralam, if I can call it that. So this is precisely what this seminar or the series of webinar series hopes to do. To look at this very fraught, interpretative realm, to look at this modality that is offered by this non-discipline or counter-discipline, which calls for a radical restructuring of accepted pedagogies and research methodologies. Over the course of this year, we are going to bring this under scrutiny, and we have a very eminent panel of speakers. But the focus is not entirely on this panel. What we're really focusing on are also the 24 respondents who are actually emerging scholars of culture studies in Keralam, of Keralam. They will talk about, in responding to the speakers, the panel of speakers, they will talk about their own work in the process of responding to established modes of thought, which I think would be a very useful framework for elaborating upon the ambivalences of theorizing and practicing culture studies in the discursive cartographies of Kerala. I take this opportunity to welcome all of you. I must confess that this webinar has many shortcomings in its organization, all of which are entirely mine. I'm from a very small, marginal state university. My center gets a funding of, you will laugh if I tell you this, around 10,000 rupees a year. This is the annual funding for the Center for Culture Studies. It is with these kinds of funds that, some of us situated in these very marginal state universities are functioning. I think this is something that the world needs to know, because I still remember when I went to, I was abroad for some time, and I desperately wanted to go for a conference on South Asian media studies. I think the entry fee was $1,000, if I remember correctly. That is half of a month's salary for me. So I just couldn't make it, and I repeatedly tried writing to the organizers, telling them that I'm from this part of the world where these kinds of fee requirements are not there. So I think in the spirit of a public university, that is what I have tried to do. We are not charging anything. There is no. I mean, anybody can come in. Anybody can sit through these webinar series, a series of lectures, and have a stake in what's happening. Uh, uh, this is in tune with the function of a public university in India today, anywhere in the world for that matter, to resist the kind of monetization that is happening or that is coming into our own public education system. So I just have a group of very enthusiastic students who are my primary assets, and they have been running the show. I'm in Delhi currently, but they did everything. And I want to begin by thanking my students, all of them culture studies scholars in Keralam. Thank you so much, all of you. I'm not naming anybody, but at the outset, I think it's important because this is the kind of collective endeavor. This is the kind of passionate scholarship, I think, that makes culture studies in Keralam so significant today. It is born out of a certain kind of an engagement with such texts and contexts. I take this opportunity once again to welcome all of you. I particularly would want to welcome Rajan Gurukkal sir to our midst today. He doesn't need an introduction to any of you here, but currently a renowned historian, a renowned scholar, a renowned public intellectual. Currently, he is the vice chairperson of the KSHEC, Kerala State Higher Education Council. I welcome you, sir. I welcome all the other dignitaries, including M.A. Baby, sir, and all the other panelists. Thank you so much for being with me today. Over to you, Professor Gurukkal. Gurukkal, sir, can we begin?
Yes. Shall I start?
Yeah, sure, sir.
I hope I am audible. Thank you, Professor Meena. Uh, Mine is only an introductory outline of what Professor Meena has already delineated briefly, though. I am focusing only on cultural studies, research, and theory. So here, let me clarify at the outset. Culture is ideological for me, and Marxist method is theoretical. I firmly believe that it is a misnomer to use the expression Marxist ideology. So you have to bear in mind another clarification I would like to make. I am a student of history, and therefore my approach has inclination to the historical, and various reflections wouldn't suit how scholars in literature do. And third one is that I'm not going into the specific details of the culture of Keralam because I am focusing only on the preliminaries of method as the way of doing and methodology as the science of the way of doing. So I understand methodology as the science of production of new knowledge. And for ensuring that kind of an outcome, what the researchers should be doing is my concern. As you know, as scholars in literature take cultural studies as a field of critical engagement with the dynamics of the contemporary culture, as Professor Meena has very lucidly put across. Researchers in cultural studies probe into the power relations of cultural groups, relations, practices, institutions, and behavior. Their approach is inevitably multidisciplinary and demands convergence of theoretical anthropology, sociology, political science, and history, and various other fields of knowledge. Now, let me start with some of the basics about the subject matter of study, culture. It's important for a student of cultural studies research to know what culture means to social sciences before he or she goes about investigating how to know uh, the working of the culture, how culture works in the contemporary society. As a term, culture signifies textures of life manifesting in arts and crafts of subsistence and survival, involving ideas, thoughts, beliefs, faiths, rites, rituals, passions, values, relations, functions, food habits, dress, art, language, literature, music, dance, etc. Culture implies the intangible, the embedded in the physical, and is an aggregate of traditional habits and practices. It is to a great extent amenable to transmission through language. In fact, that accounts for why scholars in literature stake their claim legitimately to develop their field of inquiry as cultural studies. Culture has material as well as non-material dimensions, which sometimes overlap, intertwine, merge, and transpose. Material culture refers to material objects or artifacts that people produce and use for subsistence and survival. Artifacts signify art, craft, technology, and aesthetics. That is the art of designing, coloring, and decorating, the craft of producing and using them, the technology of doing all this, and the aesthetics behind everything. As expressed in material, all this is material culture. While the use of artifacts, their uses, use context, purpose, and relations form part of the material culture too. Its meaning, beliefs, values, rules, norms, morals, language, organizations, and institutions constitute the non-material dimension of culture. And to my humble self, all these are part of the ideological. Non-material culture is symbolic culture involving metaphysical ideas, symbols, cults, rites, and religion, which at the same time have manifestations in material culture as well. That's why I'm saying in certain contexts, it is difficult to draw a line of demarcation between the non-material dimensions and material dimensions of culture. Uh, Culture changes while tradition continues. Many use the term culture and tradition as interchangeable words. Here, I should draw a technical distinction between term and word. Term, as you know, is free of synonyms. Term means term, and it directly signifies conceptually enabled field of knowledge, or it signifies knowledge theoretically produced. Whereas words, as you know better than I do, have synonyms and they have only contextual meanings, and they would sometimes have lexical semantics, and sometimes they will have metaphorical connotations. And even if the writer uses a word to denote something, the reader has every freedom to go after what it connotes. But this sort of flexibility doesn't exist in the case of a term. So as a term, what culture means and what tradition means, it should be clear to a researcher in cultural studies. For many scholars, culture connotes a refined state of life expressed in the various attributes already stated. And there it's quite clear that it is entirely ideological. Discussions of the fundamentals of culture generate a type of knowledge that is ontologically different and has the lurking danger of being essentialist. It's indeed researcher's choice to accept what ontology she would like to pursue. Whatever ontology it may be, the researchers have to push it through the dialectical process of cognitive encounters and critical epistemological assessment for establishing reality and reliability. Now, one question I should clarify at the very outset is Keralam an intelligible cultural landscape? As far as a student of cultural research is concerned, is there anything called, I'm speaking from the point of view of theory and also with methodological preoccupation, is there anything called an intelligible field called Kerala? For that matter, is there anything called regional culture? You know, a negative answer, no doubt, offends everybody. But none of the enthusiasts can intelligibly define regional culture. For that matter, any of the cultures. Of course, there are ethnic groups with clear cultural identity. A region of multiple ethnic groups can have only an imagined culture that is inherently composite. Keralam culture, as hyphenated, is a generic expression and state-centric abstraction of a composite culture subsuming several traditions reinvented from time to time. Culture is change that people accept as continuity. It's a construct, an invention. Cultural studies sometimes overlook this fact and often fail to make out that much of what is being hailed as old heritage and considered integral to regional culture is recent fabrication. Interestingly, much of what such studies inadvertently happen to celebrate as traditional is actually modern. Essentialism creeps in when they write culture for a people or a region in the name of decolonization, inspired by the fight against imperialism, or localizing under the influence of postmodernism, dismissive of totalization. It can under the pressure of both decolonization as well as postmodernism. There is an ontological double bind there. Nevertheless, characterization of culture as well as tradition uh, is viewed particular, and of course, the particular is historical and real, I have no doubt about it. And also, it has undeniable political significance. Anthropologists are often concerned to show that social and cultural phenomena are results of underlying processes that we have a tendency to overlook, and that they are this something other than what they seem to be. Reification stands for the opposite, as you know, that we take phenomena for given as they appear to us. The concept of culture is a reification, a complex aggregate of processes which differs from people to people, or which people share differently to a great extent or to lesser extent. When we refi, we do not see the details because they are overshadowed by the whole. We think of Keralam as if it were one thing, while in reality, it's a near infinite agglomeration of people, projects, actions, expressions, and objects in constant movement and conflict within a landscape which is neither homogeneous, stable, nor graphically, geographically bounded. Now, for example, when I say I am a Keralite, it's a reification, which hides the countless other things I also am. Similarly, Marx claimed that in the context of reification, money was a reification, a fetish of the production process. The labor that creates the values that money measures is a predicament necessitating the precedence of analytical logic and theoretical preoccupation over uncritical predilections in pursuing cultural research. Theory is central over there. In fact, a cultural studies student, cultural studies researcher has to be indispensably theoretical. Now, naturally, we will have to ask, what is this thing called theory? I don't want to go into the etymology of theoria and all that, but we should have a working knowledge about it for the time being, at least to understand what I would like to say. Theory is an all-inclusive abstraction of ideas which explains a phenomenon with logical proof dependent on certain general principles independent of the thing explained. It is explicit, universal, abstract, discrete, systematic, complete, and predictive. As the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant stated, theory relates to transcendental. Theory is the output of transcendental deduction. And I hope you know what is called Kantian synthesis. The synthesis of existential sensory perception, that is pure reason or a priori knowledge, which Kant critiqued. Kant's critique of reason, both the books are famous. So we all go by a priori knowledge, but transcendental deduction is a synthesis between the a priori and a posteriori knowledge. So there, uh, it is not the intuitively given, it's not the empirically given either. There is a synthesis of the two. A quick review of the rise of theory is relevant here. As you all know, Isaac Newton shook the world of 17th century with his theory of gravity. The specific theory of gravity first, and then the general theory of gravity as part of the universal macromechanics. His Principia Mathematica produced theories unveiling laws as yet unknown and enabling prediction. Newtonian knowledge was one of formal, structural, mathematical, and of authenticity, authority, credibility, and universal acceptability. It's absolute induction that one can see in the knowledge structured by him. It turned the 18th century into the age of enlightenment and the 19th century into the age of reason and science. Some of the intellectual movements of the age of enlightenment I have to be quickly referred to here. They are the standing monuments or the path of knowledge production. And also they all happen to be intellectual consequences of Newtonian theory. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, Voltaire's essay on the universal history, the manners and spirit of nations, from the reign of Charlemagne to the age of Louis XIV, published in 1756. Then Francois Quesnay's Tableau Economique, published in 1759. Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Spirit of, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Then Adam Ferguson's The Essay on the History of Civil Society, published in 1767. Then John Miller's Observations on the Distinction of Ranks, an inquiry into the circumstances which give rise to influence and authority in the different members of a society. And incidentally, it was Miller who laid the foundation for understanding society in terms of structures and processes. And it was Ferguson who talked about the mechanics of society. Newton, who talked about macro mechanics of the universe. Now, all these studies were straining at least to be theoretical because of the intimidating presence of Mathematica Principia written by Newton. Now, Thomas Malthus the essay on the principles of population. He also talked about the laws, enunciated the new knowledge in the form of fundamental laws for obvious reasons. As I said earlier, as rather acted as an imposition on all the intellectuals of the time. Mathematica Principia acting as an imposition, an intimidating locus classicus of knowledge on all intellectuals of 18th century. And that age is well known in history as the age of enlightenment. A continued adherence to the enlightenment tradition of analysis in the cold light of reason made 19th century the age of reason, and then subsequently the age of science, because the word science got a privileged status during the period, and it was during the period Newton was considered as the father of science. He had passed away without knowing that he was father of science, because he wrote his Mathematica Principia as part of natural philosophy. The age coined the term science to mean the highest form of knowledge and used the expression scientific method to legitimize a given type of knowledge production. It was this Newtonian perception of knowledge and knowledge production which laid the foundation of modernity. But generally, literature students hardly take modernity like this, or they don't focus themselves on the epistemological foundation of modernity, but they rather take modernity as a trend in literature. Regarding socio-cultural studies, Auguste Comte, positivist uh, theoretician, or who promulgated the positivist laws of three stages: the theocratic stage, metaphysical stage, and positive stage in the development of the knowledge domain. They are, for him, quite decisive to think about. The difficulty in theorizing social affairs. His project was to write social physics following Isaac Newton, but he failed even after writing 5 volumes. Then he made a hierarchy of the knowledge fields becoming science in the ascending order. He conceived the what is called the simplest of all fields of knowledge. According to him, mathematics was first to become science. Then astronomy followed, and then physics, and then chemistry and bio. And he admitted that sociology would be the last one to become science. He conceived the social affairs extremely complex, and then to him it was even difficult to theorize. So culture and society, or culture, art and society, were so complicated for Comte that nobody would be able to generate theoretical knowledge that is reliable. So that kind of skepticism has always been good. The 3 centuries sustained this: 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Although 19th century was the first occasion for pronouncing it, the 3 centuries witnessed the constitution of knowledge in the form of grand theories that are epistemologically distinct, teleological, universal, and totalizing frameworks of comprehension. The classic examples of grand theories are: number one, Newton's theory of planetary physics; Marx's theory of dialectical materialism, Darwin's theory of evolution, and Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. Now, like Isaac Newton, uh, who shook the world in the context of the universal mechanics, Marx literally shook the world with his dialectical materialism, the social universe, and thinkers engaged in understanding the social universe. All these grand theories opened up and dominated certain domains of knowledge, based on which, during the subsequent ages, disciplines got constituted and got entrenched. Comte's thesis of positivism, that was the result of the Ace compulsion to make knowledge scientific, and grand theories that opened up knowledge domains led to the parceling out of the extant knowledge, particularly the knowledge generated during the age of enlightenment. Uh, Upon the enlightenment wisdom about social affairs and processes, or human affairs and social processes, social disciplines got constituted. And they all knew that it would be extremely difficult to go anywhere near what is called the hegemonic science. But at the same time, science being the most powerful legitimizing source, it became necessary for every branch of studies, every field of studies, to uh, suffix the term science with it. That's how the expression social sciences came into being. So their science term is working as a legitimizing force. Those graduated anchored in discipline of literature have to escape from their disciplinary silos to be successful researchers in cultural studies. Because as at the beginning, Professor Meena pointed out, now it doesn't get confined to any particular discipline. It is inherently transdisciplinary, and the path to be uh, to be in the domain of interdisciplinary understanding, one has to be gaining a certain velocity in the terrain of multidisciplinary understanding. But we have this wrong tradition of using multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary as interchangeable. Multidisciplinary is uh, basically discipline based, but interdisciplinary is not like that. Interdisciplinary work, as defined by Roland Barthes, so much discussed these days, is not about confronting already constituted disciplines, none of which, in fact, is willing to let itself go. To do something interdisciplinary, it is not enough to choose a subject or a theme and gather around it two or three sciences or two or three disciplines. Interdisciplinary consists in creating a new subject that belongs to no one. So interdisciplinary research is research in terra incognita. Now, understand the material before you theorize. That's very important. Any cultural study student should understand the cultural material, uh, whatever ontological position he or she would take. Culture studies researchers should be proficient in the analytical method of formalism, structuralism, and semiotics to be thorough with the cultural material they focus on for inquiring into its contemporary political dynamics. Now, for example, somebody who is studying folkloristics in the capitalist society, how folklore is being commoditized, and how folklore is losing its cultural autonomy of the ritual sphere, and how it is uh, getting alienated, and how it is subjected to the processes of fetishism. For understanding this, one should really know what uh, the folklore really means. There are classical understanding, I mean, classical methods of analyzing and defining folklore in general, as well as in terms of specific examples. That kind of thoroughness, see, what we see in Radloff's analysis of the Tatar Indian stories, or the Russian formalist Vladimir Prop's analysis of fairy tales, morphology of the folk tale. It's thorough understanding of the cultural material in terms of its structure, composition, and processes of transformation. They should they should be taken as models for our young researchers to know what method one should adopt, what analytical strategy one should adopt, knowing the cultural material in its entirety first before going into the dynamic of its political operation in the contemporary society. They should acquaint with the analytical rigor of Radloff, or Vladimir Prop, Jan Vansina, the well-known author of Oral Tradition, and others before investigating into the political use of the cultural material called oral tradition or folklore. They should know how classics set models to be emulated in cultural material studies, in linguistics, in poetics, in folkloristics, in anthropology, both structural and new anthropology, etc. Now take our own classical example. Panini's Ashtadhyayi is the classic example of linguistic analysis in Sanskrit. And Tolkappiy's Tolkappiyam is the classical example of classic Tamil poetics. How the old Tamil compositions were subjected to detailed analysis for him, now which compelled people to believe that Tolkappiyam was written first, and then all the poems were composed according to the stipulations thereof. But that is the general understanding in the old tradition about the grammatical text as well. Some Sanskrit even today think that Panini's Ashtadhyayi came first, and then Sanskrit began to be used according to the grammatical stipulations. But a cultural studies student should focus on these works, which were certainly based on the then extant texts and their analysis, rigorous structural processing led to the making of texts like Ashtadhyayi or Tolkappiyam. That is the case with any of the studies made by the leading formalists and structuralists. Formalists laid the foundation, and then scholars followed. And in the process, they discovered something happened in the country. They all discovered Panini. And in fact, Panini's method was introduced by Ferdinand Saussure to his students. And he never wrote a text, perhaps. He might have thought that there was nothing new in his formulation. So he wrote only his lecture notes, and which his students copied and then published as the work of So sure, you know that. Uh, in linguistics, as in the case of Ferdinand Saussure, formalism manifested in a very creative way, particularly in the context of opening up ways of understanding cultural texts, ways of understanding traditional texts, ways of understanding literary texts of the past. So we find uh, modern linguists talking about these classics, from Bloomfields to Chomsky. So Saussure introduced it, and then Roman Jakobson, a very important formalist, developed on it, and you find the chain getting extended through a number of other Russian formalists. Now, what the linguists uh, developed and what the formalists developed converged at some point, and later on, scholars made use of both. In linguistics, uh, the analysts developed what is called syntagmatic structure, where the syntagms are identified as constituents of a linear structure, and each structure signified each constituent signified the structure on the one side, and also the constituent just before and after. This is the significance of syntagmatic structure. If you imagine a string with various constituents, but each constituent occupying a specific position and discharging a function, remaining different from the constituent before that and constituent after that. So this linear structure therefore has the uh, specific feature of constituents signifying their position function, and also the other constituents through proximity. This was taken up by the formalists, and they made use of it in a very brilliant way. The best example is Vladimir Probst's morphology of the folktale. And we have a Propian model adapted for the study of northern ballads. And there is a work by Vadakkan Pattinda Paniyala by M.R. Raghava Varya, a very brilliant work. It is an adaptation of Vladimir Propp, but it opened up a totally new universe of the northern ballads, not only northern ballads, but southern ballads like Iravi T Pillai Paattu, Chenganur Adi's part, and so on. That is incidentally about Kerala. Now, you find continuation of the linguistic tradition in structural anthropology. Claude Lévi-Strauss introduced a different kind of structure, different from the structure introduced by Radcliffe Brown earlier. Lévi-Strauss introduced what is called syntagmatic structure. I have no time to go into the details of syntagmatic structure. You may be familiar with it, but if some of you are not familiar, you, for the time being, understand it as vertical structure. And instead of the constituents signification operating in the linear fashion based on proximity, in syntagmatic structure, it is not based on proximity, it is based on the signification of the idea. It is paradigm which is important there, and what is connoted is important in syntagmatic structure rather than denoted, or there is no direct denotation over there, unlike the syntagmatic structure. Now, all these technicalities should be at least tentatively or tenuously uh, uh, must be acquired by a researcher in cultural studies. Uh, Anthropologists of the earlier tradition also should be understood. Earlier anthropologists like Malinowski, Emily Durkheim, um, Evans Pritchard, Radcliffe Brown, Max Weber, of course, Marcel Mauss, and then they should come to Levi Strauss before practicing the modern thinkers in anthropology that who thought about the danger with anthropology as a handmaid of imperialism and how it represented communities and cultures and how through representation communities and cultures were misrepresented, disfigured and so on. But it is important to know all these anthropological uh, say luminaries before one is practicing Garfinkel or James Clifford and George E. Marcus and so on, writing culture. What is this thing called writing culture? Some of you may be familiar with the Garfinkel's ethnomethodology and then James Clifford and George E. Marcus writing culture, or Rosalind Thomas uh, writing about the representational effect of anthropology and so on. Anyway, anthropology got reconstituted through the writings of such ethnographers and then uh, new anthropologists. It is essential to know uh, what is uh, what is semiotics. Just as one is able to understand linear structure and then its constitution and syntagmatic structure and its constitution, in both signification takes place. There is a signifier location as a craft and then uh, identification of the signified as an academic effort for which one has to graduate herself in semiotics of C.S. Peirce or John Deely or Umberto Eco, and Pierre Baudrillard. Before applying Cameron Shackle's ubiquitous technology culture analysis, how ubiquitous technology has made a transformative change in the domain of culture. And it requires a lot of serious understanding of semiotics, what is the thing called semiosis, and also metasemiosis. There are only a few illustrations by way of such things in my lecture. Uh, you can very well imagine the commendable body of theoretical literature relating to all that I have mentioned. But these few illustrations are put across just to give you some idea about the effort a student has to take in mastering cultural material first. And of course, it is certainly some kind of ontology which you need not necessarily be interested. You have to decide what ontology should satisfy you. And ultimately, your ontology is going to be subjected to epistemological analysis by the scholarly world to accept or reject it. Now, let us take up the question of theory's centrality. Interpretations in cultural studies have to be theoretical, and for that matter, any explanation is theoretical to a certain extent. But when I say they should be theoretical, I have a different understanding about differentiation across theories. a theory should be epistemologically valid, not only as a theory by itself, but as a theoretical critique of other theories, which, to my limited knowledge, uh, critical theory is the only one. Marx, Frankfurt School adopted version of historical materialism or is critical political economy. That is, that is at once theory of intellectual depth and emancipatory praxis combined. It is a critical, it is a critical theory of theory, and therefore rightly called critical theory. Critical theory explains the formation transformation continuum of socio-economic and politico-cultural aggregate or the mode of production by unraveling the contradictory dynamic therein and the homological linkages, so homologous linkages across economy, technology, polity, jurisprudence, ethics, religion, and culture, determined as the last instance materialistically. It establishes correlations between the economic processes and power relations, cultural practices, rites, rituals, institutions of control, institutions of domination, etc., etc., even at the micro level. Even at the micro level, if you analyze, you find critical theory occupying a very decisive position there uh, for ensuring intelligibility of interpretation and also ensuring intellectual depth of the theory constituted. Now, we should also think about the background quickly. Uh, a person, and we should know the stream against grand theory and the uh, epistemological context of the outbreak of that. I mentioned about Newtonian physics, which provided the epistemological foundation for grand theories. Now, post-Newtonian physics demolished the foundation, or post-Newtonian physics demolished the Newtonian foundation of authority, authenticity, universal applicability, absolute induction, and so on. Scientists like Max Planck from 1900 onwards started talking about uncertainties. Uncertainty about the release of energy, the Planckian quantum release of energy. He discovered quanta and theorized about it. And then a big mathematical reaction also came from the French mathematician Gödel, who talked about the mathematical undecidability of certain phenomena. You should recall Mathematica Principia of Newton, in which he promulgated calculus, complex mathematics, as the language of God's creation of the universe, or the language necessary to understand the universe creation, whether God created or some other force. And mathematical were able to represent Newtonian theory. Now here is Gödel talking about mathematical undecidability. And then following this predicament, Gell-Mann, Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Feynman, and various other scientists called progenitors of new physics. They attributed limitations such as subjectivity, uncertainty, imprecision, unknowability, and so on uh, to science, to physics. The new physics deprived the scientific theory of its context-free laws of universal applicability, certainty, precision, linearity, objectivity, stability, finality, and whatnot. So the absolutist inductive structure got completely destroyed by physics itself. Now remember, it was on this foundation, the, uh, the so-called foundation of certainty, stability of the Newtonian physics, that the entire Enlightenment intellectual products were made. You find the social sciences developing on this foundation, and they all were inadvertently foundationalistic. But now this foundation crumbled down, and there occurred an intellectual predicament in knowledge production. Now, it is this intellectual production in knowledge production that Lyotard essayed as the postmodern condition. This is how one should differentiate modern and postmodern in the context of the historical process of production of knowledge, and also focusing on the epistemological features of both. I mean epistemological features of the two sciences, physics and new physics. It's necessary for a researcher in cultural studies to understand the epistemic foundation of modernism and postmodernism, and similarly of structuralism and post-structuralism, rather than mistaking them as trends in art and literary criticism. This development of science weakened the totalizing project of grand theories in the non-science domains too. The state of this state of knowledge production created a big confusion among social scientists as well. They all started becoming very humble, and then tried to go back to phase of social studies, because the new science and the foundation, or they felt postmodern thinking cracked the foundation of social fields of knowledge. How various responses came in. The researchers in cultural studies have to at least tenuously acquaint themselves with some of the important responses. Yes, I was talking about the responses to the postmodern condition, or the intellectual predicament caused by the science which shifted from certainty to uncertainty. Now, the response was first, in a very humble way, made by the constructivists, who sought to construct knowledge through representation, imagination, understanding, intuition, and so on. Insights of English constructivists, for example, constructivists such as G. Bateson, H. Simon, von Foerster, von Gleisefeld, and Rorty. Some of the very important personages, as well as French constructivists like Piaget, Morin, Valéry, Lemoyne, and so on. These are scholars quite relevant to the cultural studies researchers. Similarly, hermeneutics made its own response, rather reconstituting itself, developing a means of interrogation into the deepest textual conditions to know symbolic interaction in culture. Paul Ricoeur, Carl Otto Appel, Eugen Habermas, Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty, Martin Heidegger, and John McDowell are the famous theoreticians to be recalled. again, to mention um, a few very important scholars who are, to me, very helpful to cultural studies researchers. Now, hermeneutics as science of interpretation too provides insights into the foundational aspects of interpretation. Nevertheless, all this becomes critical and creative only in the minds of cultural studies researchers knowledgeable in critical theory. Now, to wind up, I would prescribe proficiency in analytical tools, enabling comprehension of the cultural material first, and then command over a sound theoretical framework comprehension profusely reinforced by insights drawn from many maverick theoreticians, facilitating epistemologically grounded interpretation as essential competencies for researchers in cultural studies. One is theoretical tools, the other a solid theoretical framework reinforced by multiple theories, of course, without being contradictory, and if you are very serious about critical theory, without being eclectic. Now, holding political economy as the central framework of understanding, one can use without being self-contradictory or eclectic the insights of Antonio Gramsci, George Lukács, Althusser, Mark Bloch, Max Horkheimer, Theodore W. Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, Emmanuel Terre, Milazzo, Godelier, Frederick Jameson, Nikos Poulantzas, Pierre Bourdieu, Badiou, or for that matter, any of neo-Marxist theoreticians. They all may be very helpful for the researchers. So there is no freedom to make a choice for a cultural studies student about being theoretical or not. In fact, that kind of choice doesn't exist. You may need insights from philosophers like Spinoza and Nietzsche, uh, maverick philosophers for that matter, and then thinkers like Mikhail Bakhtin, 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 Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, Gilles Deleuze, and phenomenologists like Hippolyte and Merleau-Ponty. In short, every researcher in cultural studies has many things to learn from, to my opinion, any of the theoreticians, old and new. Nonetheless, it is extremely important to be aware of the techno-capitalist force that transforms culture into an industry today. Culture as an industry of capitalism. Culture as an industry itself. They started with the commoditization of culture. Now uh, culture is capital because it as commodity has enabled capitalism to diversify multiple commodities and facilitate higher and higher accumulation. So in that sense, in techno-capitalism, both knowledge and culture are both commodities and capital. As Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno maintained long back, culture has lost its autonomy from the obligation to reproduce capital. Culture, in other words, becomes nothing more than the reproduction of mass community and mass community's conformity. It is a reproduction of conformity in the minds of people. To some extent, Bart Chomsky, in an Americanized way, talked about manufacturing consent. I have always seen the interesting development in literature studies, culture studies, and so on in the universities of the United States, that first they introduced historicism, new historicism. Uh, of course, an adapted kind of tender version of Marxism, and even a tender version of Marxism would not be rendered plausible in the American academic setup for obvious reasons. Marx and Marx language just cannot be used plainly and explicitly there. And therefore, you have what is called a camouflage of it, and therefore new historicism. And cultural studies is another version. Instead of directly talking about critical theory or historical materialism and Marx's understanding of reification of culture, fetishism over there, analysis of literature, all these. So literature, in Marx's understanding, as you all know, constituted part of the base, part of the superstructure. And then, of course, various writings by the post Marx era or neo-Marxists, Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, and various others. They all started talking about literature as an object that can be approached with a relationship of cognitive encounter for generating critical understanding, generating critical ideas, which would form sometimes part of the basic structure even, that knowledge. And in that sense, it became important that Anglican understanding became important for people who did matter in serious literary theory in American universities. So they adopted this expression, harmless as far as the conservative critics are concerned. For example, scholars in Chicago School may not get offended if you talk about cultural studies. But what is the theoretical foundation of cultural studies? There is nothing else other than critical theory. This type of what you call a surreptitious operation is not required in our country, and particularly in Kerala. So therefore, students in cultural studies research must be quite open and free in understanding what Marxism as a huge field of knowledge generation has contributed, and they should make themselves well acquainted with that to be a serious student in cultural studies research. And at the end, once again, remember that Marx wanted to upset ideology. The whole huge book, German Ideology, was written for that. He wanted to destructure ideology as what is called concoction of truth or disfiguring of truth. And for that, he made his theory. Marx never constituted ideology. Marx critiqued ideology to establish the epistemological position of, although Marx didn't use the term epistemology, now with the help of other studies in the domain of knowledge called Marxism or Marx theory, one can say Marx wanted to epistemologically establish his theory, and he was quite sure that when theory was just a tool in the hands of the bourgeoisie, like us, university professors, it would constitute the superstructure only. It would be another tool in the hands of the exploiters, but it should form part of the basic structure. And the effort of the cultural studies researchers should be to generate critical knowledge that can occupy the basic structure and encourage the prime movers in the process of emancipatory struggle. And, and for that, the language is very, very important. Use of language for expressing knowledge. Now, I firmly believe that the expression Marxist ideology was a very clever imposition on Marxists themselves by the capitalist intellectuals. Thank you very much.